Hi everyone, welcome back. This is vodcast 3. It is our final vodcast of the learning unit, and today we're going to kind of wrap some things up. We're going to talk about how thinking plays a role in learning because, for the past couple of videos I've talked a lot about how you learn behaviors, right? So you learn to be afraid because of this happening, or you learn to do this because of a reward and consequence, but we haven't really talked about how you're thinking about the rewards and consequence or thinking about what's going to happen next really matters. And the last little bit I want to talk to you about is something called social learning. So, like I said, not all learning is just, oh, there's a typo there, a behavioral association. There's a lot of evidence that shows that your thoughts or cognition, right? So we talk about that's this finger right here, the cognition, right? Play a role, an important role in learning. That it's not just about a behavior, but it's about thinking about things, expecting things, knowing what might happen next, making predictions. So one of the ways that they show this is originally they thought classical conditioning was all just a behavior, right? So this, your brain associates this, and then you feel this, right? Bell meet salivate, bell salivate, right? And the dog doesn't think about it, the dog just does it, right? Well, we learned this is not actually true, that there must be some cognition involved because the dog or the human is able to predict what will happen next. The dog is able to predict that the bell will mean food, right? So there's a thought process there. And one of the ways that they prove this is with a very famous experiment by Sigmund, and what they did is something called learned helplessness. So what they did is they took dogs, and this is kind of a little example here, and they basically took dogs and they attached them to like electric shocks, and then they wanted to see if some of the dogs in group A, when they were shocked, they were allowed to escape, but then other dogs, when they were shocked, they were not allowed to escape. So they experienced a shock and there was no way for them to get away from the shock, okay? Then what they did is they put them in a box or like a crate where they could escape the shock. So it would be like all they had to do was jump over this little barrier to get away from what was shocking them. And it turns out that if they were originally not able to get away from that shock, if they had predicted that there would be no way for them to remove themselves or to get away from the shock, that even when they were allowed to escape, even when they could get away from the shock, they didn't even try, right? So they literally predicted or expected that there was something they could do, so they just stopped trying, okay? Another reason why we know that classical conditioning must involve some sort of thought process is because sometimes we use classical conditioning to treat alcoholics. So we'll like give them a drug and put it in their drink so it makes them sick, so they learn to connect the alcohol with vomiting. The problem is that this doesn't actually work a lot of times because the person who's doing the drinking, the alcoholic, knows that the drug is only in the drinks that they have at their therapist's office and not in the drink that goes to the bar. So they're able to understand and know the difference between the two of them. Okay, something else. So, classical conditioning involves thought, operant conditioning involves thought. So what they did is something that's called latent learning, right? And Tolman had these mice, and he wanted to see if mice could learn a maze quicker by giving them treats, right? That's operant conditioning, giving them reinforcements. So he had one set of mice learn a maze and gave them little incentives all the time. And then he had another set of mice, didn't learn the maze with incentives, just let them kind of figure it out on their own. And then he gave both groups of mice, he tested them, Group A and Group B, who could go through the maze quicker. And it turns out that the mice who were not given any reinforcements while they were learning, but eventually given a reinforcement at the end of the maze, could learn it or had learned it or knew it just as well as mice who had gotten little reinforcements all along. So this is something called latent learning, and it's the idea that learning sometimes occurs, like the mice were learning the maze, but they didn't actually demonstrate their learning and like finish the maze until there was an incentive to do so. So they were learning it, they just didn't choose to demonstrate it until later, right? And an idea, the way that they show this is something called a cognitive map. So it's like the mice, by exploring the maze, had like a map of what it looked like formed a map in their mind. And so when they were given a treat at the end of the maze, they had that cognitive map and could use it, but until they had a reason to use it, they just didn't, right? And that's latent learning. It's learning that you don't show until later, okay? The other example of how we know operant conditioning involves thought is something called the Justification Effect. So we've learned that If you give rewards consistently, the rewards like actually ruin your internal motivation to do something. So an example of this is like when you were younger, if you got those Great America like tickets or whatever for reading, eventually you're like, oh, well, I'm not going to read because just for fun, like where's my prize, right? So sometimes if you give too many rewards, people can actually, it can like ruin their intrinsic or natural motivation to do something, and then they only want to do it for the reward. Okay, so last little bit. Sometimes we learn things without directly experiencing them, and this is called social or observational learning. It's learning by observing or watching others, okay? It's also called modeling. So, one of the reasons, or one of the most famous experiments that they did to prove that this works is called the Bobo doll study. Basically, children watched adults beat up a Bobo doll, and if they saw the adult beat up the Bobo doll, when they were in the room together or alone with the Bobo doll, they beat him up too. So they watched the adults do it, and then they repeated the behavior. And I'll show you a movie of this in class happening so you can see it. The guy responsible for doing this experiment, his name is Albert Bandura. Bandura Bobo doll. Nicely fits. So there's two ways that modeling can be used. Modeling can be used for pro-social behavior, which means that like sharing. So like you watch someone share and then you share. Or you watch someone open the door and then you open the door, right? Or antisocial, which is like unproductive or destructive behavior. So like you see someone share and then you share is pro-social. But if you see someone beat up someone and then you do it, that's antisocial. So modeling can either be used for good or for bad. Okay, why does modeling work? How come we're able to watch other people and then learn? It's because of a very cool, awesome part of your brain that my very favorite person in the whole world talks about, Ramachandran, right? And he talks about mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are these neurons in your brain that when I see you doing something, right? So I see you brushing your teeth, my brain lights up like I'm brushing my teeth. Right? So the neurons in my brain actually activate as if I'm doing it, but the only reason my body knows that I'm not doing it is because I'm not getting the messages from my arm to my head saying, oh, I'm moving and I'm brushing my teeth, right? So mirror neurons actually light up the same way as if you were doing it, as if you saw someone else do it. And so this allows you to watch somebody, and your brain thinks you're doing it when you're watching it, and then this helps you learn the behavior, okay? And we learned this by watching monkeys. There was an experiment where they were watching a human open up and eat a nut, and it turns out that when we looked at their brain in the MRI, that it looked like they were eating the nut when they watched the human eat the nut. So monkeys have mirror neurons too, okay? So mirror neurons, they would allow you to, they're also like if you see somebody get cut, right, and you're like, right, you ever had that feeling where you see something bad, and that's because your brain can actually imagine what it feels like to feel that pain, because your brain feels like you're experiencing the pain when someone else is, because those same neurons are lighting up. Those are mirror neurons. Very, very cool. Ramachandran. All right, so that's all for now, AP Psychos, and remember, psychology is flippin' awesome.